At the conference in Cyprus, we discussed what an important challenge it is here in Europe to raise the literate level in order to give people a fair chance to actually live in society as private individuals, active citizens, employees and parents. Professor Gunther Kress from the University of London is one of our most significant scholars in the the literacy field. He has an outstanding ability to see the relationship between social changes and changes in modes of communication. Professor Kress, I am very honored, proud and grateful to see that you are here again. And thank you so much for coming back to Denmark, sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you so much. Please welcome Professor Gunther Kress.
Well, thank you very much, Clara. And of course, flattery is, never mind money or dinners, flattery is the most important way of getting somebody to do things that you would like to have done. But it's a great pleasure to be here. And it's a pleasure because every time you're asked to talk about something, even if it's quite familiar to yourself, of course you're challenged to think about it in relation to what this audience might be like, what their expectations are. And while I'm talking to you, I'm attempting to get my computer started or restarted. It's gone to sleep. So for me, it's a very important thing to be able to be here. Some of the things which I hope to be able to say might be challenging. Challenging is a peculiar word. They might be outrageous, you might disagree, they might be very strange. For instance, I'll use a word like semiotics a lot. It is a frightening word, but it's actually very simple. It says, I'm interested in meaning, wherever meaning appears and wherever it occurs. And as Clara says, I am very interested in making the connection between ordinary things that we do in the everyday and how they are embedded in and arise out of and are produced by the social conditions around us. So that's really, in a sense, what I'm attempting to show. I'll do it. Okay. This hasn't sort of appeared on the screen. Can you? It's all right now. Okay. So, as I say, I'll do some things which may seem a little bit strange, and I hope you will be patient with me in doing that. I'm going to talk about the future of reading and writing in alphabetic cultures. Now, what do I know about the future? I know as much about the future as you know, except that I think that to think about the future of writing and reading, one needs to think about the future of the social. It's in social life, in everyday social life, in the most ordinary, banal practices of social life, that meanings are made. And the conditions are made for changes in how we do things. So I suppose I sort of think about what is the future likely to be like, and in thinking about that, I think what was the past like, and how much change has there been in the past, to get a sense of where we are now, and from that perhaps speculate about what the future might be like. So I know nothing about the future of reading and writing, but I think that present trends in social life and in the social organizations of the kinds of societies in which we live go in a particular direction. Now, I live in England, and I've lived in England now for 20 years, and England is kind of leading the way in the direction of a neoliberal something or other. It isn't a society, because neoliberals don't really believe in the social. They believe in the individual and the individual's ability to do the kinds of things that she or he would like to do. In England, this manifests itself in particular ways. You will also be familiar with privatization. All the kinds of things we thought were kind of social responsibilities done by the state are now being handed over to private enterprise. And for instance, in England, the police force is being privatised. That's quite a big step. From now on, there won't be an ordinary state-employed police person who will arrest me or kind of stop me when I'm going too fast, but it'll be a private company. And it will take me to court, and it will see that I'm prosecuted in order to be put into a privately owned prison. That's different to what things were like 20 years ago. The school system in England will not be a school system anymore because it is rapidly being privatised, already has been in a large measure, and it's being privatised in relation to the interests of the groups which are taking over or beginning to build their own kinds of collections of schools. So whereas the school before had a function of providing all members of a society with similar kinds of intellectual goods and skills and abilities, now, of course, these will be different. This particular group will do these kinds of things. That group over there will do different kinds of things. A faith group, different kinds of faiths, will kind of use the school to promote their... So instead of the school acting as a means of producing a social cement, the school, no longer a system, because there won't be a system, is actually producing divergent, maybe contradictory, maybe often quite strongly opposed notions of what the world is like. So, in that kind of context, I think about what will the future be. And the future, I think, will continue to go in that direction for a while until it begins to emerge that this isn't really how people want to live and something else will happen. So, for me, the social, such as it is generative of the semiotic. In other words, meanings are made in social life. And that's the starting point for me. Of course, we do have brains, and we might have something called a mind, and the mind is formed, if we believe in what Vygotsky told us and other people have told us too, the mind is formed by how it responds to the social life around us. Speech and writing in alphabetic cultures have a history of unstable relations. I called my talk, I mentioned that I'm thinking about alphabetic cultures, and it's really important to think about alphabetic cultures because the script system of the alphabet has a particular effect both in relation to making us believe that speech and writing are linked. The alphabet is a kind of a system that makes us think that it's really a means of transcribing speech into writing. But of course, in cultures which have been literate for a long time, writing has developed its own processes, its own rules, its own practices, its own forms, quite separate from speech. And of course, in different language cultures, that relation is different. For instance, in English is a language made up of as you know, of very different kinds of language groups, Germanic groups initially, and then several overlays of French groups. And so the spelling system of English is an attempt to come to terms with the spelling system of French and the spelling system of kind of Germanic languages. Very different, say, for instance, to Italian or Spanish. So that has to be borne in mind. But the alphabet also is very different to cultures which have a script system which does not attempt to transcribe speech, such, for instance, as ideographic systems, character-based systems. And so I think this is very important. Speech and writing have a distinct and different trajectory, each shaped by maybe shared social purposes. In Denmark, as in England, as in Germany, as in other parts of Europe, you have a standard language, or assumed standard language, and you have many dialects. And of course, people coming from the different dialect regions have a different relation to the standard, to those that might come from a middle class in England, a middle class background where the standard is more or less reproduced in the family every day. Of course, there is then, in addition, the question of, for instance, people who come from a different linguistic background and their relation to the language. So, I want to say something very, very quickly and very simply about the meaning of script systems. A script system is very, very common in the kinds of societies that we're familiar with. And young people from the earliest ages engage with it in all sorts of different ways. And in learning the script system of their cultures, they learn things which go beyond what is a letter and how do letters combine into words or words into sentences. And I want to show you what that means. I've shown these examples before, and some of you will know them from things I've written and published, but I'll do it anyway. So here is the 3-year-old writing. And what she's doing, she's reproducing, as far as she's concerned, the script system of her culture. And here is another 3.5-year-old also writing. And as you can see, she lives in a different script system. Now you might say, in English, the term for this would be scribble. She's just scribbling. I would say whenever somebody's doing semiotic work, purposeful activity, purposeful action, then it's meaningful. So I'm asking myself, what is the meaning of this? What kind of sense has this young person made of the script system of her culture? And the contrast with the other one, I think, makes it quite easy to see. So this young person knows that the script system of her culture is displayed on a line. And she knows that there's a directionality to how she writes. She's left-handed, so at the moment, at the age of 3, she's writing with the left hand from right to left. Later on, she'll learn to write still with the left hand from left to right. But also, she knows that there is a regularity, a kind of similarity about the entities which she's reproducing. They're quite simple. Some of them are repeated. They're linked. The person who learns her script in a different script culture has a different kind of sense. Yes, the elements are displayed on the line, but they're not linked. And whereas the person in the alphabetic culture thinks they're quite simple, and some of them repeated, the person in the ideographic script system thinks all of these elements are, each one of them, different, and they're complex. So it's a very different attitude towards script. Yes, linear, but not quite linear in the same way, not linked sequentially. Very complex as against very simple, each one different, some of them repeated, very different kinds of attitudes to what the social world is like. And then a colleague and I did a research project, Charmy and Kenner, on how young people in early years of their schooling in England learn the script and languages of their families while they're in English primary schools. And so we went to these Saturday schools to see how this happened. And here is a page from something that a 5.5-year-old had done. And she's learning to produce a character in a horizontal fashion, stroke after stroke after stroke. So she knows that complex things are made of simple things. She also knows from that these complex things are made by the repetition of this, or rather by the addition of simple things, but always in the same strict order. So a kind of a social learning happens here, namely that things happen by the observance of a strict sequential order. That's not something that the person who learns an alphabetic script learns. And it's no surprise then, for instance, that in the West we think about things as being sequential and linear and unidirectional, but that in the East, and this example comes from the work of somebody who did a PhD with me, Sean McGovern, who asked his 21-year-old students at a Japanese university who were learning English to give a little biography of their lives. But this biography isn't a kind of a linear thing, it's a kind of a modular thing. It's thought in terms of these are modules of my life, one after the other, and I'm building them into a tower, a little bit, a kind of notion of the square. And as you will see, the character in the rightmost column at the bottom is actually perfectly balanced in the square. And now you can also see why the child put that first stroke not to the side, not at the bottom, not to the other side, but in the middle, because she already knew that the character will have to balance in the square. So you look at the world and think, this thing that I'm producing will have to balance in an imagined square. That's not what we're thinking of when we're writing on a line. We think about how high can the rising parts go, or how low can the lower parts go. And I'm wanting to say that script is so pervasive and so important and shapes all sorts of other kinds of things. I'll leave it there. Except to say that at the moment, it is likely to be the case that young people coming into school now will not actually become proficient in handwriting. And what will that mean? The embodiment of writing, the fact that I can actually feel how I make an O or a G or an I, the embodiment of all this knowing will be very, very differently done. I mean, on my old mobile phone, I used to have to press a numerical key several times to produce a certain kind of letter. That's very different to producing the shape of something and having it embodied. And of course, very different also in terms of the script system. So I just want to say these things are really, really important. Now, I want to look back a little bit at writing, just so we get a sense of where we are at the moment and where we're going, even at this moment. So I'm looking back to 1959. The reason for that being was that in 1999, I gave a talk somewhere somewhere in Europe about the changes in writing. And I thought I'd look at newspapers from 50 years earlier, or 40 years earlier. And here is one of these newspapers. I don't want you to try and read it now, but it is the Times, a famous newspaper. It continues to be. And you can see what that is like. Writing was a particular kind of thing. It required intense concentration. It required intense work. You actually needed, as a kind of a social subject, as an identity, to focus on this thing in order to, by work, get meaning from it. 40 years later, it already looked a bit different. Yeah? The notion of work is beginning to recede even in the Times, which was the most conservative of the significant or kind of respectable, so-called, newspapers. Colour emerges, images emerge, the articles are shorter, the spacing is less dense. The notion of work recedes, and the notion of kind of something which is pleasurable, also shaped for people who don't have much time and want to be entertained a little bit, has emerged. So the subject who reads the Times at that time is actually a different subject to the subject who read the Times at that time. Social subjectivity is formed by the materials with which we engage. As much for the two children, one from England and one from Taiwan, who engaged with writing earlier on, and it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop, not just because you're now, whatever it is, 21, or in my case, 21 plus. You continue to kind of, your subjectivity, my subjectivity is changed in my engagement with different forms of writing. In my reading, I mean, reading for me is actually semiotic work. I engage with it. And in reading, I don't recover meaning, I make meaning. It's not that my task, at that time, the assumption was that reading was recovering meaning. The task of the reader was to observe what the author had done, and as near as possible as he or she could, to recover what the author had intended. And I think that was the case for this too. And I'm going to say that this is no longer the case at the moment. So these are kinds of things. My identity is constantly changing in the engagement with the world, including the world of script or the world of representation. So I want to look for a moment much further back. I want to go back to the 17th century in England, the early part of the 17th century. It was a time of great fervour, political fervour. Of course, the English Revolution was about to happen. The king was about to lose his head. And in the city of London, there were over 130 printing presses, printers. It was a time of enormous activity, political activity, but also political in terms of religious or other kinds of activity. And I want to show you two sentence types from the early part of the 17th century, because I want to say what we regard as a syntactic, a grammatical kind of thing is always socially formed. So here is the front page of a tract, a religious tract, by a woman who was more or less self-taught in terms of writing, Anna Trapnell. And I'll show you now the first paragraph of the tract. This is the first paragraph of the tract. Again, I'll show you in a bit more detail what she's written. This paragraph has two sentences. In other words, English has been written in a serious kind of fashion, in a continuous form for about 100 years at that time, not much longer, and maybe a little bit less for popular kinds of uses of writing. So the notion of what are these units of writing and how do we deal with them and what do they do and what can we make them do is beginning to be shaped. But I also want to say that what can we do with the units of writing is not beginning to be shaped, but is continuously being reshaped, and it's being reshaped at the moment. So that hasn't changed. And I'll just read you some of the bits of this first paragraph, not all of it. And I want you to listen to the different, I know that English is, although everybody in Denmark is wonderfully perfect in English, and everybody in English is wonderfully ignorant of every other language, and that applies nearly to myself. But listen to the different tones, the different kinds of dialects, social dialects that appear in this paragraph. She says, I'm Anna Trapnell, the daughter of William Trapnell, shipwright, who lived in Poplar, in Stepney parish. My father and mother living and dying in the profession of the Lord Jesus. My mother died 9 years ago. The last words she uttered on her deathbed were these to her Lord for her daughter. Lord, double thy spirit upon my child. So you can hear the ordinary language of people kind of talking when she talks about the background that she has and her parentage. And then you can hear a kind of a religious language coming in, the language of the group that she belongs to, a Puritan group, sect. So all of this is in the one sentence. We can't, I think these days, unless we use quotation marks, import different kinds of dialects, different kinds of languages into one sentence. We think there must be some kind of homogeneity about the sentence. So, Lord, double thy spirit upon my child. These words she uttered with much eagerness 3 times and spoke no more. You can hear that being said from a pulpit in the church which she attends. And then she says, I was trained up to my book and writing. That's working class speech. I was trained up to my book and writing. Working class speech again. I have walked in fellowship with the church meeting at All Hallows, whereof Mr. John Simpson is a member for the space of about 4 years, and so on and so on. What she uses a sentence for is very different to what we nowadays, or at least in English, use a sentence for. The sentence is a kind of thematic unit. This is this part of my life. Now I'll tell you about this part of my life. She uses a semicolon where we would more or less use maybe paragraphs or full stops. She's kind of experimenting with the resources which she has, which are spoken English from different kinds of sources. She's experimenting with these. She's putting them together in writing into a sentence. And you can see this is kind of experimentation. What she has, she uses. What she has, she uses for what she wants to do. And as a principle, I think it isn't very different to what we do now. What I have, I use. Sometimes it's sufficient, sometimes it's not sufficient, and if it's not sufficient, sometimes I try to do something else. Here is simply to show you an extract from another tract by John Milton, who was Latin secretary to John Cromwell, the first Republican head of the new Republic in England. Latin secretary, educated at Cambridge in Greek and Latin, among other things. And I'll show you what his sentences are like. And his sentences in this tract, which is against censorship, Areopagotica, is arguing against censorship, which was rife because the state wanted to get control of this explosion of opinion. He says, he that can apprehend and consider vice with all her baits and seeming pleasures, and yet abstain, and yet distinguish, and yet prefer that which is truly better, he is the true warfaring Christian. You can see the kind of oratory of Latin, the balanced kind of oratory, on this side, on that side, on this side, on that side. These are the things which he has to hand, his Latin and Greek training, and he uses them in a different language, in English. And I think this idea of using what is to hand is simply what we all do, all the time. And of course, it's an important way of thinking about what children in school do. They use what is to hand. And so rather than simply dismissing what children in school do, a more important question is, what is it they have to hand and why? Where have they got it from? And if we want to give them something else to use, to have to hand for writing, but of course, conversely then for reading, it would be useful to know that. So in the middle of the 17th century, the sentence is socially shaped. The social resources shape the written form, the sentence, to meet social needs. Anna Trapnell has particular needs, and she uses the resources she has. John Milton has particular needs, and he uses the resources he has. They're very different, they're differently valued, but the principle remains the same to this day. And of course, these are the resources which we have to hand, what's around, what's available for us. We make what is needed by using that which is to hand. And I think as a pedagogic principle, if those of us here who have to do with education, as a pedagogic principle, it's very useful to think that young people make what they need with what they have available to them. Just a little bit more about, we're moving now forward 300 years to the 20th century, 400 years to the 20th century. And I'd like to show you 2 pages from science textbooks. And again, I'm interested in the sentence, what the sentence was for. You see here a page from a book published in 1936, and the author says in his preface that the boy will be very appreciative of this book because it is richly illustrated. And of course, it was the boy, because girls didn't do science. There was also a boy who was from a particular class. You didn't stay at school until 14 at that time, unless you were from the middle, maybe lower, but certainly middle classes. So class-specific, gender-specific, and addressing a particular kind of what Bourdieu calls cultural capital. Not available to, wouldn't have been available to Anna Trapnell or her successors because they had left school, because school kind of said to them, actually, you don't belong here. And then in 1988, a different textbook, also in this case for 14-year-olds, similarly for a technological subject, still science, looks very different. Not necessarily that there are more illustrations, but rather there's been a shift. In 1936, the boy could have read what was written and passed the exam. In 1989, the boy and the girl who look at this page would not know what a circuit is like by reading. The major weight of information is moved from writing to image. In order to understand what a circuit is like, you need to look at the image. So there's now been a division of labor. Writing does one kind of thing, and image does another kind of thing. And that, I think, marks an important point in the recent history of, let's say, composition in Anglophone countries. And it may be the same in Denmark. You will know that, and you will be able to translate that. Now, I want to show you the next bit here. I'm not sure whether this will actually come out as I had intended. Yes, it does. Because in the first, the 1936 textbook, you have a sentence of this kind. And if you kind of count the number of verb elements, then you'll see there are about 6 or 7, maybe 8 verb elements, things that, doing words. When a current is passed through the coil in the direction indicated in the figure, we can show by applying Fleming's left-hand rule that the left-hand side of the coil will tend to move down and the right-hand side to move up. And wherever you have a verbal element, you have actually a rudimentary sentence. So this complex sentence is composed of, let's say, 6 or 7 rudimentary sentences. It's an enormously complex syntactic entity, because what's required is an enormously complex conceptual entity in science. Again, what is needed is the possibility of expressing complex relations in the field which you're investigating, and syntax is being used to do that. But when you come to the book from 1988-89, things have changed. No longer a sentence of 7 or so simple sentences, but now what you've got is something different. In your first circuits, you use torch bulbs joined with wires, 2. Modern electrical equipment uses the same basic ideas, 1. But if you look inside a computer, there are not many torch bulbs or wires, 2. The wires and bulbs have been replaced by electronic devices like transistors, chips, and light-emitting diodes, 1. In this book, there are no sentences which have more than 2 smaller sentences in them. There's been an enormous simplification. So the question is, what has happened here? Of course, syntactic complexity is there because of a need for conceptual complexity in the particular subject domain. And of course, the habituation to conceptual complexity and syntactic complexity might lead to a certain training in cognitive complexity. And if you have the simplification of all of this down to sentences which have at the most 2, usually 1 sentence in them, you might say, well, actually, we're all getting very dumb. And in English, there's this saying which I loathe, that society is dumbing down. Yeah? But in fact, what is happening is that instead of having 1 means of carrying meaning, you have 2. And the new task is to combine these 2 forms of carrying meaning together, and the new complexity actually exists in that facility. So now you have a new task, not simply to be an accomplished reader by being an accomplished writer, but also now you have the need to be an accomplished designer of something. What shall I use image for? Shall I use color? Shall I make a realistic image? And what shall I use the writing for? And how shall I bring these together, given that my audience is an audience of 14-year-olds, boys and girls from all sorts of social groups in this one classroom? And so the task has actually changed significantly over these 50 years, and enormously, from a specific social group, a specific gendered identity, to something quite different. And I think this is where we're going at the moment. This need to design a message out of different modes, writing, image, sound sometimes on websites or elsewhere, in order to meet the demands that you wish to meet for a particular audience. Okay, I'll just show you very quickly 3 images of schools over the last 300 years to show you that the social and the kind of representational, the social and the semiotic are closely matched. So here is the school from the mid-18th century. And it is the same kind of hall in which you would have had spinning wheels. Yep? So it's the same building. Spinning wheels is a mass production of something, whether it's cotton or kind of cloth. Here's the mass production of certain kinds of knowledge. And everybody who's in this big hall, except for the few instructors at the front, is regarded as being identical. Yep? So the curriculum which is being kind of produced for this group is an identical curriculum, and then after they've all assembled in the middle, they move to the side where they have their monitors who kind of instruct them, all in the same curricular entities. There is no assumption that individual students differ. In fact, I don't know what the gender composition of these people would have been, but we know that in terms of a class composition, they were going to be as it were, the industrial fodder for the mass production dominant in the middle of the 18th century. Fast forward to the year 2000 from a research project we did on the production of school English in London, in inner city London. And what you have now is a different conception of students as learners. They sit around a table, they face each other, because it's assumed that knowledge is produced in interaction, in discussion. And it's also assumed that each of these people has something to contribute in this discussion. So a very different conception of the social. And I think, again, I want to go and say, if we're thinking about the future of reading and writing, what kinds of assumptions are we making about the people who are constituting the future or are being kind of shaped for or shaping themselves for the future, which in part, of course, we're constructing for them. This is what I'm sort of thinking. These things go very closely together. Of course, in the meantime, this is the year 2000, in the meantime, all classrooms in England now are fitted with electronic interactive whiteboards. And the electronic interactive whiteboard was introduced in order to make, I don't know whether it was meant to be teaching or learning, more efficient. Faster. Pace was a big issue. Pace, you could do things much faster, much more effectively, much more efficiently. So the teacher now has the, we can't see it here. has the electronic whiteboard at the front. She gets stuff from all over the place, including the internet. Children have little electronic tablets and they can kind of do stuff. But above all, there's now a redirection of orientation away from interacting between the students towards the whiteboard. Teacher-led, electronically kind of displayed, a very different sense of what, I'm not sure, teaching or learning are about. I think it's important to kind of be clear what we actually have in mind. So I said here the socialist prior, and so we have to ask about what is the contemporary social and political frame in relation to the transition of education, or formal education, from state to market. You will have to answer that for yourself in relation to the Nordic countries. I gave a kind of a hint of what that is about in the case of England. The state wanted citizens who had similar kinds of values, a basis of similar kind of knowledge. So even those who went to school and failed knew what they failed with. They understood that at least. Whereas now we don't know. I mean, the market doesn't want citizens, nor is it interested in producing employees, a workforce. The market wants consumers. And the consumer is produced by offering the consumer choice. I mean, my first experience of an American Walmart many years ago was kind of just bowled over because there was a huge, long kind of an aisle on both sides, breakfast cereals. I mean, the amount of work to be done by the consumer in choosing her or his breakfast cereal was incredible. But the point is that young people in schools now are, if we can call it that, socialized in terms of the market and its offering of choice. You can have what you want. You choose. Your interest is dominant. And with that kind of disposition, they come to school, and the school really still acts very much as it did in the past, that says, we know what's good for you, and here it is, and you do it. Yeah? And the electronic whiteboard actually hasn't made that much difference to that. It has actually changed the subject English, which we were investigating, because in the year 2000, English was still ostensibly language-led, whereas by the year 2006, where my colleague Carey Judd did another project, English had become image-led. So you would start, for instance, with the image of a daffodil, and then make a poem about a daffodil, or stuff like that. So I think these things are really important. Identities of people in school, and I would say people below the age of 30 or maybe 25, have been shaped in this insistent message of the market that there is choice, and you choose, you know what your interests are, and you choose according to your interests. And that is going to shape the semiotic picture and the kinds of things which will be available, made available, will be produced for us, and will change me, even me, resistant as I am and loathing of it all, will change me because I will have to somehow cope with this kind of new kind of semiotic world. So here, now, even now, or maybe for the last 20 years, identity has been shaped or has been produced as the effect and outcome of choice in consumption, whatever the consumption was about, whether it's cornflakes or whether it's kind of semiotic materials, or shoes, or jeans, or sneakers, or whatever, or cars, for that matter. The social change produces semiotic change. So if you have a social in which there is a notion of order and authority, then maybe the notion of linearity, where the author says start here and go to there, might be an equivalent semiotic notion to that. Whereas if I'm saying it's your interest which counts, I would say, look, here are lots of different things, you choose. And now think about the kinds of texts which you encounter on websites, but also elsewhere, and think, is there a move from linearity to modularity? And what kinds of requirement does modularity impose? What kinds of semiotic work does modularity impose on the people who engage with these things? So settled social arrangements could lead to a notion of canonicity of modes. We use writing for passing on knowledge. But if there aren't settled social arrangements, we might say, well, what do you think is best? Is image best? Is color good? Is moving image much better than still image? Is writing okay? Or will we use speech? Or what will we do? There isn't now a settled sense of where we can be securely aware that this will work. I've called this state of affairs provisionality, where what happens today is no guarantee that the same thing will happen tomorrow. And when things are provisional, you have to be constantly aware that what is it like, what is the environment like in which I'm communicating now? Who am I communicating with? What am I trying to say? What are the means I've got available? Provisionality was not the characteristic of the society in which I became socialized. I'm not saying that there are no gains from this, but there might also be losses. So I think we need to become rhetors. We have to say, what is the situation? What am I trying to do? Who are these people? What are the means? What am I trying to communicate? And rhetoric, I think, and designing, rather than merely competence in writing or competence in reading, will be the newly required facilities for people going out into society. One last look back at a school book in English, because we were looking there at English in 1936, a poem by John Milton, L'Allegro, and it's produced as a poem because these 13, 14-year-olds from the middle classes upward were educated into and trained into a literary sensitivity, a literary sensibility. But when it comes to now, poetry is still on the curriculum, but poetry is down the curriculum not to develop a literary sensibility, but to develop competence in communication. Yeah? So here's a poem about the Vietnam War, and on the left-hand side you've got lots of stuff, a clip from a film, and you've got a documentary photograph, and you've got some journalistic stuff about what happened in the Vietnam War, and how many people died, and when did it happen, those kinds of things. And when you come to the way things were framed, in 1936, the poem by John Milton was framed with a paragraph which was coherent, it was historical, literary, but gave you a particular kind of framing. But when you come to the framing for the poem in the year 2000 about the Vietnam War, it's not at all like that. You've got bullet points. And whereas in the paragraph, you're led from the beginning of the paragraph to the end of the paragraph in an order of the author's devising, in the bullet point list, of course, some things are first and some things are last. But actually, the bullet pointed list is for you to kind of deal with as you want. You make the order that you think is significant. There isn't coherence of the kind that there is in the 1936 paragraph. And what this also reflects, I think, is the notion of, with a breakdown of social coherence, why should there be semiotic coherence? Or why should there be, let's say, the same semiotic coherence? I can't actually imagine something being produced which is incoherent deliberately. But the kinds of coherence which now exist are very different to the paragraph that introduced Milton's poem then, and also are beginning to be different to the bullet-pointed list, where at least something was first and something was last. And we have to think about that. So from the coherent account in the paragraph, and the paragraph was something that Anna Trapnell had, but a very different kind of use of the paragraph to the bullet-pointed list. And the work required by the reader is very different in relation to each. The subjectivity produced by something which says, I've organized this for you in a particular kind of way and kind of accepted like that, makes me a particular kind of reading subject and different to the bullet-pointed list which says, look, here's a bundle of stuff. Deal with it as you would like. I'll skip past this very much, except to say, again, 1936, and again the year 2000, science, digestion. But again, the point that in the year 2000, there is again this separation of stuff about digestion, which is sort of physical, technical, where are these organs and what kind of relation. And on the left-hand column, writing used for describing stuff which is difficult to draw, like what are enzymes and how do they work, and what are proteins and what do they do in the body. So writing used for something which is process-like, and more adapted to that, and image used for something which is, I suppose, spatially displayed and much more useful for that. Okay, so from writing as a central means of communication, I think we've gone to writing as one means of communication. And so two questions which for me arise and immediately have arisen. If writing is one means of communication, then what are the other means? And if I'm using other means than writing, maybe writing was always not sufficient and could have been complemented by other kinds of things, and now are being complemented. And now the question allows me both to say, what can image do that writing doesn't or didn't? But I'm also now forced to ask, what does writing not do that image can do? And the notion of writing only being partial and not necessarily full and sufficient and plentiful in terms of conveying all the meaning that we're interested in is, I think, quite new. If writing is one means of communication, then what are the others? And then we go from, because we've got these many means, we've got something we want to communicate, we sort of have notions about the audience. We say we're going from a kind of a competence in writing or reading to the need to design a message for the audience which we have in mind. And that's a very different kind of characteristic and a different kind of disposition towards writing, but also to reading, because people now read, young people now read, in the way that we used to write. Namely, they get something and they respond to it in terms of their interest. It's like a supermarket shelf full of cardboard boxes with breakfast cereal. You go and pick this, and you don't necessarily... the loss of authority, the loss of power, the authority of the author being put into question, and the interest of the reader being put in the center, you might think is due to the emergence of the digital media. And I just wanted to show you two examples. This is an information book from 1927 called The Boy Electrician. It was written for children between the ages of 7 and 10, believe it or not, who were kind of really going to read this book to make radios and bells for the house and stuff and not kill themselves in the process. By the 1990s, information books looked like this. And you can see the difference. It's the interest of the reader which is dominant. There isn't a single author, there's a team of authors. They say, we think amphibians will be interesting for 12-year-olds, or 11 to 13-year-olds. Let's make a book on amphibians, and this is what they've done. And now, as the person formed in, a social of 50 years ago, will go to the writing first, especially the big bits of writing, because that's what anchors me. Whereas I think kids will go to the image which attracts them most. There is now a kind of a schism. There is a schism in the audience, which is sort of located generationally around about the age of 30, I would say. So that traditional forms of representation, language-based, writing-based, reading in relation to an authority of an author, as against my interests are dominant, that has kind of changed. And actually, if you're in school, the school needs to address the interests of the young. But it also needs to say to the young that forms of writing, the traditional forms of writing, will continue to be used by economic and political elites. And so if we want to make access to society as a whole, if that still exists, available to everybody who goes to school, we have to teach both. We have to teach, not that we fully understand what the traditional forms were like, but we understand them much better than the new forms, but we have to attempt to make ourselves knowledgeable about the new forms which these children use, and probably don't understand, but they use them intuitively and easily, and bring them together into a curriculum where the older forms will have to be made newly relevant, not by saying, the complex sentence is good for you, learn it. Or a Shakespeare play is what you need to know in order to understand the culture of the heritage of your society, but rather, what does a complex sentence do for you because you're interested in computer games or something? Yeah? A kind of a linking things which we think are important conceptually, cognitively, culturally, to the present interests of the audience in schools in as far as we understand them. And this notion of design, using available means, I've used this now in several publications, signs to show me how to get into the car park of a supermarket, where you use an image, because this is sort of about 100 yards before a very busy intersection in North London, and if you attempted to write everything that the motorist would need to know to get into the car park, you would cause mayhem and sort of lots of hold-ups and some minor accidents. So you use image for that which image is best for, and you use writing for that which writing is best for, and you use colour to kind of give coherence to this. But on the opposite side of the road is another supermarket, and I'm going to ask you which of these two supermarkets you would probably prefer to go to. And even those of you who don't know the English supermarket Waitrose might have a sense that one of these is more like you. Yeah? Normally, I sort of ask people to say, which would you rather go to, a Wend? And then I say, well, this is the supermarket in which mums smack their children when they don't behave. And this is the supermarket where mums say, James, we don't do that sort of thing. So, but what is it in this branding the supermarket has provided? The style, using the same resources, writing, colour, image, font. What is it in the style, the selection of styles, that speaks to me as a particular social subject? So in designing this simple kind of thing, the most banal kind of thing you can imagine, a sort of a little kind of instruction how to get to the car park, very significant choices have been made about colour, about line drawing, about font, about the colour scheme. Yeah? And this is the new world of representation. It's not can you spell properly, can you make sentences correctly? Yes, that will be there too, but it's sort of become different. And now, sort of sloganistically, I say, in that kind of instance, image shows things, writing tells things, and colour highlights things, and we can sort of see these things come together in an ensemble which fulfills what needs to happen. And in 2008, when the European Soccer Championships were conducted in Switzerland and Austria, there was a sign telling motorists in Salzburg which streets to avoid, and at what times, and on what days. And so you can see that power is always involved, right? Because the motorist who kind of did the wrong thing would say, but I didn't know it, and the bureaucrat would say, but you know, there was a sign. Yeah? So power always comes into that, and I think that's absolutely crucial to remember. So if we have a rhetorical approach, we say we need to know the understanding, the environment in which we're doing this, and in terms of these modes, I call them modes, what are the affordance of image, what are the affordance of writing, what's the affordance of font, what's the affordance of colour, in order to make my meanings material, and what are the media? In this case, a kind of a board, sort of an advertising kind of hoarding, the facilities of the technologies for disseminating meaning as messages. And lastly, of course, and this will become a point, can I go to 11 o'clock? Yeah? Become a point in the last few minutes of my talk. What kinds of genres are possible with the media? Okay, three changes I've talked about. This social change, absolutely crucial to understand. There are changes in the means of representation. Writing alone doesn't quite do it, nor will speech. And a change in the means of communication. And of course, the digital media off the screen, or screens, are most prominent. But you know, not the only ones present. And of course, the new kid on the block, as I've called it, is by now about 4 years old, I think, or 3 years old. The new mobile device is still called a mobile phone, but used now for very many different things, mainly for texting in my case, but for other people also to download stuff, to make images, to kind of send images. This has become a communicational hub. And as a communicational hub, it's changing and it's going to fundamentally change our processes of the production of messages. No longer as the kind of production by typing letter for letter as I do when I text, but rather for saying, I can refer somebody to a URL somewhere on the internet, I can kind of add an image. Yes, writing might be there, might not be there, and that is actually the world which is not just on the horizon, which is present. And I think that's what we need to understand. And of course, writing will continue, but writing will actually have to find its way and its place in that world. So I said there will be a distinct or parallel kind of strands, my forms of writing and speaking, the new forms of writing and speaking, kind of sometimes touching, sometimes interacting, but usually like geological layers, relatively separate. And I'll show you one example, again I've used that before, a poetry website, which is now about 5 or 6 years old. And this is here, the page called About Us. And if I'm part of Us, I feel relatively comfortable there. Traditional writing is present there. But when I go to the page, which is for children, which is meant to be, I think, sort of 8 to 12, what I have is this. Yeah? And you can see the shift from the traditional to the modular, from the linear to the modular. And you can also ask, what on this website for children, on this particular site here, will teach them writing? How much writing is there? What is the form of writing here? These are modules. Where Anna Chapman have the paragraph, here you have a module. The module consists of image, of color, of writing, of all kinds of things together. These are new kinds of compositional elements. And if teachers complain about children going to the internet and cutting and pasting, all they're doing, in reality, is making their own new units of representation. They're saying, this is important, I'll cut this out, and I'll put it here, and I'll kind of cut this out, and I'll put it here, and I'll add an image of my own, and a URL, and here is my composition. And that's a very different kind of process, and this is very much what I mean by modularity. This says not, this page here says, look, start up there and finish down here, but this page says, what's your interest? Yeah? And depending on your interest, you enter this page where you would like to enter this page. So the orchestration of these different modes of color, of writing, of image, and their placement in a kind of a space is up to the producer in relation to what she or he imagines their audience to be. Now, of course, this is relatively new. So in 2004, I looked at the children's website, the BBC website, and this is what I saw. Yeah? And you can see that in terms of design, the persons who designed that just hadn't a clue. I mean, why is there this empty space down there? Yeah? They had kind of put stuff on there, and then there was a bit of empty space. Well, fair enough. They would never have done that with a page, because they knew what a page was about. But by 4 years on, it's become different. Yeah? So the new site and the possibilities, the potentials of the new site have been explored. This actually, when you click on it, is in movement. There are sort of bird sounds in the background, you know, stuff going on. But the core is still your interest decides where you will enter. And the modules, of course, they then change depending on what you enter. The modules are different kinds of modules, and where, I ask, is writing. And what does reading mean now? I mean, reading really means what reading meant 1,500 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, when you scattered runes on the ground, or somebody did, scribes did. People had kind of scraped things on a runic tablet, a bit of beech wood, scattered and picked it up and kind of thought, what can this mean? What does it mean? The English word riddle, kind of something to guess about, is there. Reading is the recovery of meaning according to what best information I have and what kind of experience I can bring to the thing that I'm interpreting. Reading is no longer, I mean, despite what the English National Curriculum and the National Literacy Hour says, it's not about the phonics of kind of making letter match to letter and match to letter, especially in a language where it simply cannot apply, such as English is. Reading goes back to that very ancient thing of how can I make sense of this in the light of my experience in the past. So new kinds of principles of composition which we need to understand in relation to the social environment and their social implications. Linearity giving way to modularity. What are the elements of composition? Are they kind of selected from the internet? There's still selection, there's still arrangement. And what are the effects of social networks? I want to sort of stop there because I've come to 11 o'clock and I won't say anything, for instance, about this new thing of the blog and its composition, or different kind of blog, food blogs, I'm about to start a project on food blogs and composition of them. And I won't say anything about the tweet, except to ask if the tweet is a new kind of element, significant element, used by very many people constantly. What does the tweet afford? What can you do with a tweet? What kind of community can it create? What kind of community doesn't it create? Can it create a society? Can you produce narratives in a tweet? And if not, what's going to happen to the narrative? Can you produce reports? What kinds of genres are made possible? What kinds of genres are not made possible? In relation to, I'm using the Twitter as a particular site, in relation to the so-called social media sites, what kinds of things are ruled out, but which are used by most of the people in the classrooms, where young people are there to learn to read and write in a traditional sense. So these are the kinds of questions that I ask myself. We can see, I think, more than just over the horizon. It's actually in our present, things which ought to make us think really seriously about two things. What do we actually want to preserve about writing and reading? Do we want to give up the narrative? Do we want to give up the complex sentence? And if not, how will we teach that to young people to make it significant for them? But also, what is possible with these things? What kinds of forms of community are made possible? Or are they transient? Are they permanent? What's behind it all? And can we bring this in and make it useful in a classroom which is ostensibly still about reading and writing? Thank you very much.